WizardChess is a tactical chess roguelike that we've been developing since early 2020, and for some reasons we'll get into, it's maybe not the most typical Steam early access game, but I think that's why it might be something interesting to hear about in our experience. Depending on your personal level of cynicism regarding the games industry, you probably think of early access as either a utopic vision where developers can get players to actually help develop a game, or a scam where developers can get players to give them money for an unfinished game. And the reality is somewhere in between for a lot of games on Steam. After the release of our previous game, The Thin Silence, we were determined not to take the one big splash approach to release again. We work on games part-time, and we tend to have an appetite for pretty complex ideas, so our ideas take a long time to make. And we wanted to develop WizardChess publicly during that long development period, and let the market signal to us that there was an interest in this game, and build up a slow rolling momentum towards the full release. The single biggest problem we encountered in early access is expectations. We knew why early access made sense to us and why we were doing it, and players have their own expectations of what's going on with an early access game, and getting the two to align is difficult. Even if you write it in the Steam description that it's only two of you, it's only part-time, that we want to co-develop it with the audience, people don't have to and don't want to read every word of your Steam description. They might just think it's a game for sale, and if it doesn't work properly or there's some jank in it or it's work in progress, they might be upset. And you almost can't blame them because Steam doesn't really set people's expectations up in this way. They just pass it all over to the developer to let you write several paragraphs of text no one will ever look at. Due to the weight of these expectations, early access has always had a mixed reputation on Steam, both for developers and players. And yes, there are some games that have been massive successes in early access, some that couldn't have been made without it, and there have been some that never made it out, and some that maybe shouldn't have made it out of early access. With WizardChess, we quickly realized that players, for the most part, don't actually want to play a work-in-progress, janky, half-finished game. They want to play something that is mostly finished so they can give their opinion on that and then move on with their life. And that's fine, but it's not really what we were looking for from early access. We have been accused of abandoning the game and of being stuck in development hell for several years, when the reality is we're just taking a long time to make a video game. But I understand how people have these conclusions because they're comparing our output and our communication to a full-time studio of maybe 5, 10 people, etc. You just don't know. We have been very lucky to have a few dozen players show up in our Discord who actually did exactly what we hoped. They played the game, they gave in-depth feedback, they playtested multiple patches and helped us understand what was working better and worse, and that's been incredible. But I'm actually not sure that early access was required to get that experience. So what do you need to know if you're thinking about putting a game into early access? Well, first we got to work out what is it that you're actually trying to achieve. I think it's way too easy to skip over this step because it's pretty obvious what most people want out of early access: some amount of feedback from players and some amount of money before the game is done. The problem with that kind of thinking is that you might not get either of those things, and you might actually significantly change the perception of your game going forward having released it into early access. One really clear example of this is if you're making a story-driven, linear, single-player game, I can't see how early access would make any sense to you because people won't play the game more than once, so how can they give you feedback iteratively to tell you if it's getting better or worse? Just think about this sort of stuff with early access where is someone going to feel like they got their money's worth if they encounter a problem while they're playing your game? For some games, multiplayer games especially, not really, they'll be okay with that. But if all they have is the linear experience you've mapped out and they get hard blocked on it, well, they're going to be pretty upset that they spent their money on your game. So people love to act like they know how the Steam algorithm works and how to maximize your chance of success on Steam, and this is literally all hearsay designed to make you pay money to marketing consultants who've read the same articles as you, but there is a difference in how Steam treats early access games and regular games in terms of their general reach to players on Steam. I don't know specifics, and I doubt that this stays the same for very long, but it seems like an early access release gets less publicity than a normal full release does, but you get it twice when you first enter early access and when you leave to go to a full release. I don't know whether those two split up events add up to the same size as the regular boost you get, and to my knowledge, nobody can tell you that answer, but I do believe that it makes a difference. One thing we discovered with early access is that a lot of features you might normally implement towards the end of a game's development get front-loaded, like tutorials, options menus, debugging tools, save file recovery tools, bug logging and exception tools, analytics. You need to have all this stuff in there way earlier if you're going to be able to make use of it to help solve players' problems. And for example, a lot of games don't have a title screen until they're pretty much finished. Well, if you're in early access, you're gonna need a title screen before that last moment. I probably sound like a broken record by this point, but for an early access release, players are expecting near release quality, and for a normal game development project, you won't reach this point until about 6 months before release. On the business side of things, publishers tend to see early access as quite a risky decision for a game, and very few publishers will choose to publish a game after it's already been in early access. Shout out to Two Left Thumbs, our publisher, who took exactly that risk on us. From a productivity point of view, we severely underestimated how much of an impact early access would have. I work as a software developer in my day job, and I'm used to shipping software continuously with patches on a regular basis, getting bug reports from users, looking at analytics. But the legibility of a video game and having all the balance flow through end to end and the kinds of bugs you can run into, the surface area is a lot larger than most commercial software, which is something that not everyone is aware of in the first place. But making games is a lot harder than making regular software in my opinion, and keeping a game functional in every single patch along the way when I have a few hours a week to work on bug fixes and change logs and the videos that explain those changes we've made, it can be a lot. And the problem with this is that as productivity goes down, the project takes longer, the feelings of futility or frustration get stronger, and the guilt of not having yet finished the damn thing is maybe the hardest part to deal with of all. I think that generally speaking, the emotional side of game development is pretty under-discussed. We work in a surprisingly brutal space for something supposedly about fun, where you can spend 5 years working on your passion project and put it up on Steam, only to be told by someone that it isn't worth a fraction of the $10 asking price. And this is what's so hard about early access, is that it puts this external emphasis on the game from the beginning. You're always worried about the perception of the thing you're working on, and that can be motivating because if people are excited about it, it makes you want to charge ahead. But equally, excitement can make you make poor decisions, as so can the fear of letting people down. It kind of adds this extra layer on top of the already difficult process of making a video game in the first place. Anyone who's been making things online for a while has developed a pretty thick skin. You get runaway comments and mean things said to you all the time. That's not really the hard part. The hard part is when people give voice to your doubts you have about your own project. Am I going to finish this thing? Is it going to be good? Is it taking much longer than it needs to? Well, it's one thing to think these things yourself, but it's another to hear players saying them back to you, and that's maybe the most destructive part in terms of motivation is, yeah, they can see that I'm struggling, and that's not a welcome part of the process. Ultimately, I would say that the emotional aspect of early access is the heaviest cost. We stopped having nearly as much fun making this game once we were in early access, and it has felt like a second job to me for a large portion of that time. So what would we do differently next time? I think the main takeaway is that we would wait a lot longer if we did early access at all. We redesigned a large part of WizardChess while already in early access, and that's why we've been in early access for almost 3 years. That's much longer than people are expecting. I think 12 months is close to the limit of what most people are willing to tolerate for an early access game. And I mean, most of our players have been very understanding in that time. It hasn't been a huge problem. But the ones that aren't so understanding can be a bit of a handful, and the emotional bandwidth of a human being is finite, right? Like, I have a day job, I have a social life, I have like hobbies that I do other than game development, I am making a video game, and then there's all the accountability that comes with early access, and sometimes if game development is your retreat and your creative outlet, experiencing exactly the same feelings you do at your day job, but in your spare time, it's not something everyone would enjoy. I'll put it that way. I think, in general, one problem with the way that games are marketed these days is that something like early access, or a YouTube channel, or even just tweeting about your game regularly, these things can all pull you away from your core creative focus on the game itself and start to worry too much about marketing and optics and expectations. And most articles on the internet will tell you something like, indie game developers don't worry enough about marketing. But I think the answer is more like, indie game developers are afraid of having to be in the headspace of marketing because it takes them away from the reason why they're making the things in the first place. Marketing's not evil, but it can actually mess with your own creative vision, and you can start working on ideas that you don't necessarily care as much about because you think other people might like them. I think beyond early access, this is what I'm worried about in the indie game space currently, is that the incentives are there to only worry about market signals, and no incentives are there to actually make something creatively interesting or fulfilling for the developer. A few years back, I had thought that early access would be a good way to form a community around a game like WizardChess. I'd hoped that if people were browsing Steam and they saw the screenshots of the videos, they tried to demo it at Next Fest, that they would be willing to take the risk to click that buy button and that they might end up, in the iteration process with us, helping us work on the game. I think the reality is that I was quite naive, and it worked almost the opposite way, that when you land on the Steam page for an early access game, it looks like every other game. They don't know who you are or how you're working on it or what your intentions are, and I think if I'd wanted to form a community around the game, I needed to lead with that part of what we're doing, rather than acting as if we're just another studio making an indie deck builder on Steam. Okay, well I think that's going to do it for this video. If you'd like to follow along with the last chapter of WizardChess's development as we get out of early access, then please consider subscribing here or following me on Twitter or joining our Discord, links to all that down below. And of course you can wishlist the game on Steam or buy it now and tell us what you think. I'd love to hear your opinion. And until then, I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.